Lauri Markkanen has played beyond anyone's expectations in the last 2 seasons for the Utah Jazz. Last season was such a revelation he won Most Improved Player and earned a spot on the All-Star team. It was a remarkable season and the major reason the Jazz won more games than anyone predicted. Not expecting to be as successful as they were, the Jazz had to continue dismantling the team to get the most out of their own pick in the 2023 draft. Because Danny Ainge values the Jazz assets and refuses to undersell in a trade, it took time. At that trade deadline, Utah moved Malik Beasley, Jared Vanderbilt, and Mike Conley for a lightly protected 2027 Lakers first-round pick. It was enough of a move that it allowed them to lose more games that season, eventually landing the 9 spot in the draft that year. Even though it didn't end with Utah winning the lottery, it ended up being a great draft for Utah. They got a promising young player in Taylor Hendricks and got the steal of the draft at number 16 with Keyonte George. Hendricks looks like a potential game-changer defensively, and Keyonte George has shown incredible promise as the future point guard. Fast forward to this season and the Utah Jazz find themselves in the exact same position. In some sort of deja vu, the Jazz traded veterans at the trade deadline to give their young players a chance to develop while also improving their draft position. Right now, they have the 8th spot in the draft if the draft was held today. With only a handful of games left, the Jazz have to decide how to proceed with Lauri Markkanen. Performing their own version of mid-lottery Groundhog Day is not the best plan for building a championship contender. The Jazz have said that the goal is a championship and that each move is with that in mind. They're not going to make a move for a quick win-now gratification just because losing sucks, and they will look at each player and ask themselves if each player is a potential fit with a championship core. This puts the Jazz in a tough situation. Yes, Lauri Markkanen is a good enough player to be on a championship team, but Markkanen puts the Jazz in no man's land. He's good enough to lift Utah out of the lowest part of the lottery, but not good enough to take the Jazz to the greatest heights of the league. So what should they do? Since the NBA trade deadline, the Utah Jazz have been losing games exponentially. The priority now is to give Keyonte George, Taylor Hendricks, and Bryce Sensabaugh time on the floor to see what they can do while also improving their draft position. They want to see if they are championship caliber players. Even though each rookie has shown real promise, it's difficult for young players to win while their youth develop. Yes, Keyonte George looks like a potential star, but he needs more time and talent around him to lead a team deep in the playoffs. Taylor Hendricks has also shown real promise defensively, along with showing flashes of offense, but he's also not there yet. The Jazz have been left with a group of veterans who, combined with their youth, have the worst record in the league since the trade deadline. If there's one thing that's been proven during this time frame, it's that the Jazz are much closer to the Wizards and the Pistons than they are to the Nuggets and the Celtics. Unlike the 2024 draft, which has no prospects with obvious superstar upside, 2025 has some serious stars at the top like Cooper Flagg and Ace Bailey. And Danny Ainge and the Utah Jazz know it. Knowing that the Jazz have ended at the same spot the last 2 seasons around pick 8 or 9, do they really want to miss out on the top 5 in the draft again, especially with star talent at the top? That brings us back to the Lauri Markkanen question. This offseason, the Jazz can renegotiate Markkanen's contract and work to keep him long-term. The question is, should they? The obvious reaction from Jazz fans to that question is of course they should, but it isn't as easy as you might think. Here are some reasons why the Jazz might consider moving him this offseason. The Utah Jazz still need an MVP caliber guy. We know that Lauri Markkanen is an elite off-ball shooter and scorer, but anyone saying he can be the lead guy on a championship team is not accurate. Can he be a number 2 on a championship team? Possibly, but even that is up for some debate. Now, if he's your number 3 scoring option, you've got something special. If you think Markkanen can develop into that, I'm not saying you're wrong, but he hasn't shown any real signs that that is a possibility. In his time in Utah, Markkanen has been completely dependent on the offense and the point guard to get him the ball to score. Here are some stats from NBA.com that show what I mean. Markkanen averages 1 post-up per game, scoring 1.02 points per post-up possession. How good is that? It's the 57th percentile, a little above average. Markkanen averages about 0.8 isolation plays per game, scoring 1 point per possession. How good is that? It's the 67th percentile, which is pretty good. You could argue he needs more of these, but it's not an elite number. Markkanen is also not a high-level ball handler, and even with one of the lowest percent of turnovers while he's on the floor at 12%, he still has an almost even assist-to-turnover ratio of 2 to 1.3. That likely doesn't get better if you start running actions through him on a regular basis, but you have to spoon-feed him the ball in these situations, as proven by some of these other statistics. Markkanen is non-existent as a pick-and-roll ball handler, scoring just 0.33 points per possession possession on 0.2 attempts per game. That puts him in the first percentile in this category. It's not a part of his game at all. And Markkanen is surprisingly inefficient as a pull-up three-point shooter. For the season, he's shooting just 20% on pull-up three-point shots. Yes, some of those are bailout shots at the end of the quarter for Markkanen, but to be that low is surprising for a player considered to be one of the elite shooters in the NBA. It's just a reminder that yes, Markkanen is an elite catch-and-shoot player, but he is not a player that runs a pick and roll, nor is he a player that likes to pull up from three in a half-court situation. Those are the things that superstars have to be able to do when you're looking to win a title, and those are the shots you have to be able to make in playoff situations, especially if you're the number 2 guy on a championship team. So, how do you get that player on the Jazz to pair with Lauri Markkanen and Keyonte George? Some are saying that you simply trade for that player. The issue with that is that it's historically incredibly rare for that to happen. Of the last 24 teams that have won the title winners traded for their best player 2 times, used free agency 9 times, and drafted them 16 times. That means that 8% of NBA title winners have traded for their best player. The Kawhi Leonard trade included a bad situation in San Antonio, with Kawhi Leonard forcing a trade, and if you consider Kevin Garnett the best player on those Celtics teams that won the title, that also involved a player that languished on a Minnesota team unable to get enough talent around him. The reality is teams just aren't going to trade you their MVP player. They either stay with their team, sign supermax extensions, or take deals in LA or Miami. So, a trade for another team's MVP in their prime is extremely unlikely. And the other scenario is an MVP player chooses to come to Utah via free agency, which isn't going to happen. That leaves the draft, the place where Utah has seen the vast majority of its success. It's where they drafted an MVP before, and the avenue they are most likely to get that MVP player again. Which brings us to our next point. Trading Markkanen gives you a great shot at a superstar in a draft loaded with potential superstars. As I mentioned before, since the Jazz traded some rotation bets while sitting Markkanen, Utah has lost at the highest rate in the league. People have justifiably complained that they should have done this last year with Wembanyama in the draft. In looking at what the Jazz have done this year, I disagree. Utah has made smart trades with each of their vets getting acceptable to incredible returns in each move. You don't get those returns if you rush these moves, and now Utah is loaded with picks that could land high in the draft. Unlike last season when the Jazz had a roster loaded with rotation players, they only have a handful of vets left they could move for assets. Those vets include Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, John Collins, and Lauri Markkanen. During the lead up to the NBA trade deadline, we heard that Lauri Markkanen wasn't untouchable. We also heard different buzz around each of those players. Was Utah already doing the work to make that happen? Perhaps Utah has seen what the ceiling is with a team of Lauri Markkanen and friends and isn't interested in another finish in the 8 to 12 range come the 2025 draft. Yes, you could walk the tightrope of trading Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, and John Collins and keep Markkanen, but then you run the risk of winning in just enough games that you miss out on that potential star. Or worse, do you lose trade leverage with Markkanen growing frustrated and demanding a trade? It's also important to know that with Will Hardy coaching, you will maximize the talent of each player on your roster and win some games you didn't expect. Let's also not forget how many players rest on their trip to Utah too. Trading Markkanen while his value is so high gives you a chance to gain even more draft capital and even more chances at elite stars in future drafts. Cooper Flagg is the prize in 2025, but if you haven't heard the name AJ DeBonsa, who is coming in the 2026 draft, you will soon. The Jazz are walking a tightrope, and the last 2 seasons have led them to the mid to late lottery. Trading Markkanen and veterans like Colin Sexton are moves that help them have great shots at a superstar in the draft. Those draft picks are Utah's best shot at a future MVP and years of championship contention. And isn't that exactly what the Jazz have said they wanted?